My name is Brenda, and at 67 years old, I thought I had earned the right to dream. But sitting in my own living room last Tuesday evening, listening to my children plan their European vacation without me, I felt smaller than I had in decades. "You're too old to travel with us, Grandma," my son Michael said with that patronizing smile I had grown to despise. "Just watch the house." Little did they know the next morning would change everything. Before we dive into this story, I'd love to know where all of you beautiful people are watching from today. Drop your location in the comments below, and don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe for more incredible true stories. Trust me, what happened next will leave you absolutely speechless, so stick around because this journey is just getting started. The whole mess started during what was supposed to be our annual family reunion planning meeting. Every year, we gathered in my living room to discuss our summer vacation, and this year felt different. There was an electricity in the air, an excitement I hadn't felt since my late husband Robert was alive. My son Michael arrived first, his BMW pulling into my driveway at exactly 7 p.m. At 42, he was always punctual, always proper, always successful. His law practice had made him wealthy, but somewhere along the way it had made him cold too. He walked through my front door with his usual rushed energy, checking his phone before even saying hello. "Mom, we need to make this quick tonight," he announced, loosening his tie. "I have briefs to review before court tomorrow." My daughter Sarah came next with her husband David and their 2 teenagers. At 38, Sarah had inherited her father's determination but none of his warmth. Her marketing executive job had taught her to see people as demographics, and lately I felt like she saw me as the elderly dependent category. "Hi Mom," she said, giving me a quick peck on the cheek before immediately scanning my living room like she was evaluating it for a client presentation. "David, can you help the kids set up their tablets? This might take a while." Finally, Michael's wife Jennifer arrived with their 2 younger children. Jennifer had always been the most vocal about family decisions, and I could tell from her expression that she had already made up her mind about something. She settled into my favorite armchair without asking, spreading travel brochures across my coffee table like she owned the place. "All right everyone, gather around," Jennifer announced, clapping her hands together. "We have some exciting news to share." The 4 grandchildren, ages 8 through 16, crowded around the coffee table while the adults formed a circle. I remained in my kitchen doorway, wiping my hands on a dish towel, waiting to hear about plans that I assumed would include me. "This year, we're thinking bigger," Sarah began, her eyes lighting up with genuine excitement. "Europe, Paris, Rome, Barcelona. 2 whole weeks of culture, history, and adventure." My heart leapt. Europe. I had dreamed of seeing the Eiffel Tower since I was a little girl. Robert and I had planned to go for our 25th anniversary. But then his heart attack happened, and dreams became memories that never were. "That sounds absolutely wonderful," I said, stepping into the living room. "I've been saving money specifically for a big family trip like this. I have over $15,000 set aside and my passport renewal just came through last month." The room fell silent. I watched as my children exchanged glances, the kind of loaded looks that parents give each other when they're trying to communicate without words. Jennifer cleared her throat uncomfortably. "Mom," Michael began slowly, "this trip is going to involve a lot of walking, different time zones, unfamiliar food, language barriers. It's going to be physically demanding. I walk 3 miles every Tuesday and Thursday with the hiking group at the community center," I replied, my voice steady despite the growing pit in my stomach. "Dr. Martinez says I'm in better shape than most people 20 years younger." Sarah leaned forward, her marketing training kicking in as she tried to find the right words to package rejection. "The thing is, Mom, we really need someone responsible to stay here and watch the house. You know how the neighborhood has been lately, and someone needs to water your plants, collect the mail." "We could hire a house sitter," I suggested, though I already knew where this conversation was heading. Jennifer finally spoke up, her voice carrying that tone I had learned to recognize as barely concealed impatience. "Let's be realistic about physical limitations here, Brenda. This isn't going to be some leisurely cruise. We're talking about climbing stairs in ancient buildings, navigating crowded airports, dealing with jet lag. At your age, it's just not practical." The words hit me like a physical blow. "At your age." As if 67 was ancient, as if I had 1 foot in the grave instead of years of adventures ahead of me. I looked around the room at my family searching for an ally, but found only uncomfortable silence and avoiding eyes. Even my grandchildren, usually so eager to include Grandma in everything, were quiet. 16-year-old Emma stared at her phone while 12-year-old Jake fidgeted with a travel brochure. The 2 youngest, Michael's 8 and 10-year-old daughters, looked confused by the tension they could feel but couldn't understand. "Of course," I said finally, forcing my voice to remain calm and gracious. "You're right. Someone should stay and take care of things here." The relief in the room was palpable. Michael's shoulders relaxed, Sarah smiled her professional smile, and Jennifer nodded approvingly as if I had finally come to my senses. "Great, so it's settled then," Jennifer said, gathering up the brochures. "We'll leave you a detailed list of everything that needs to be done while we're gone. The trip is next week, so we need to finalize bookings tomorrow." Next week. They had been planning this for weeks, maybe months, and I was only hearing about it now. The realization stung worse than the initial rejection. The rest of the evening passed in a blur of logistics and excitement that I was no longer part of. They discussed flights and hotels, restaurants and museums, packing lists and itineraries. I served coffee and homemade cookies, playing the role of the supportive mother and grandmother while inside, a piece of my heart was breaking. By 9 p.m. everyone was gone. Michael kissed my forehead and promised to call from Paris. Sarah hugged me quickly and reminded me to keep the house keys handy for any emergencies. Jennifer waved from the car while the children pressed their faces against the windows, waving goodbye. I stood in my doorway, watching their taillights disappear into the night, listening to the silence that filled my house like water filling a sinking ship. After everyone left, I walked through my empty house, turning off lights and picking up coffee cups, trying to process what had just happened. The living room still smelled like Jennifer's expensive perfume, and the coffee table bore ring stains from forgotten mugs. I settled into my favorite chair, the one Jennifer had claimed so casually earlier, and let the weight of the evening settle over me. In the lamplight, I could see my reflection in the darkened window, and for the first time in years, I looked old to myself, not dignified or experienced or wise, just old. My mind drifted back to the early days of my marriage, when Robert and I would lie in bed on Sunday mornings, planning all the places we would visit when the children were grown. We had a shoebox full of travel brochures hidden in our closet, right next to the Christmas presents and tax documents. Paris was always at the top of our list. "When Michael graduates college," Robert would say, tracing patterns on my arm, "we'll spend a whole month in Europe. We'll drink wine in French cafes and throw coins in Roman fountains." But Michael's college graduation came and went, and we were helping him with law school expenses. Then Sarah needed a wedding, and there were grandchildren to spoil, and Robert's construction business had a slow year. There was always something more important than our dreams. After Robert's heart attack 5 years ago, I thought my traveling days were over before they had even begun. But in the past year, something had changed. Maybe it was joining the hiking group, or maybe it was watching other widows in my book club take cruises and bus tours to national parks. I had started to believe that it wasn't too late for adventure. I walked to my kitchen table, where I had left all my research from the past month. Travel magazines with dog-eared pages, printouts from European tourism websites, a notebook filled with my careful handwriting, documenting exchange rates and weather patterns. I had done my homework, prepared for this conversation, ready to prove that I was capable of being their travel companion instead of their house sitter. My savings account statement lay on top of the pile, showing the $15,000 I had accumulated by clipping coupons, buying generic groceries and skipping meals out with friends. Every dollar represented a small sacrifice, a choice to prioritize my future adventure over present comfort. I picked up the passport that had arrived just 2 weeks ago, my photograph showing a woman with bright eyes and a hopeful smile. The passport was good for 10 years, I had told myself when I applied. 10 years of possibilities, of stamps from countries I had only seen in movies. Now it felt like expensive wallpaper. I poured myself a glass of wine, something I rarely did on weeknights, and sat at my kitchen table surrounded by dreams that suddenly felt foolish. Maybe they were right. Maybe I was being unrealistic. When was the last time I had been on an airplane? When was the last time I had been anywhere more exotic than the mall in the next county? The hiking group was one thing. Walking familiar trails with women my own age, knowing that my car was parked just a few miles away if something went wrong. But Europe? Different languages, different money, different everything. Maybe I really was too old for such adventures. I thought about my friends at the community center. Margaret had taken that bus tour to Yellowstone last year and came back with stories and photographs that made everyone jealous. But Margaret's children had encouraged her trip, had helped her research and plan. My children saw me as a liability, a burden, someone who needed to be protected from her own ambitions. By the time I finished my wine, it was nearly midnight. I gathered up all my travel research, my careful notes and highlighted brochures, and put them in a neat stack. Tomorrow, I decided, I would throw them away and focus on being the best house sitter and grandmother I could be. But as I turned off the kitchen light and headed upstairs to bed, I caught a glimpse of myself in the hallway mirror. The woman looking back at me didn't look defeated. She looked angry, and maybe, just maybe, she looked determined. I have always been an early riser, a habit left over from 40 years of getting children ready for school and husbands off to work. The next morning I was up at 6 a.m. as usual, padding around my kitchen in my slippers, making coffee and planning a day that suddenly felt emptier than it had in years. The morning routine was comforting in its familiarity. Coffee first, then the newspaper, then watering the plants on my front porch. It was a beautiful spring morning, the kind that made you believe in new beginnings and second chances. I stepped onto my front porch with my watering can, breathing in the sweet smell of my neighbor's flowering dogwood tree. Mrs. Patterson next door was already in her garden, a woman my age who had never let retirement slow her down. She waved, and I waved back, grateful for the human connection. That's when I saw them. Scattered across my front lawn like oversized confetti were papers and envelopes that definitely hadn't been there the night before. At first I assumed it was trash that had blown out of someone's garbage can, the kind of neighborhood nuisance that happened on windy nights. But as I got closer, I realized these weren't random papers. They were organized documents, official-looking envelopes, the kind of papers that people keep in folders and briefcases. I set down my watering can and began collecting them, my curiosity overriding my annoyance at having to clean up someone else's mess. The first envelope I picked up had the logo of a major airline in the corner. The second was from a hotel chain. The third was a rental car confirmation. My heart started beating faster as I gathered more documents, recognizing the systematic organization of a planned trip. It wasn't until I had collected everything and carried the pile to my front steps that I really looked at what I was holding. And what I saw made my blood run cold. 6 airline tickets to Paris, departure date in 3 days, hotel confirmations at the George V, one of the most expensive hotels in the city, rental car reservations for a luxury vehicle, travel insurance documents covering 6 passengers for 14 days in Europe. These weren't random papers blown from someone's trash. These were my family's vacation documents. My hands were shaking as I spread everything out on my porch table, organizing the papers like evidence in a crime scene. The booking dates showed that everything had been purchased 2 weeks ago, long before last night's family meeting. The passenger names were clearly listed: Michael, Jennifer, and their 2 children. Sarah, David, and their 2 teenagers. 6 passengers, not 7. My name appeared nowhere on any document. They hadn't just decided last night that I was too old to travel with them. They had planned this trip without me from the very beginning. The family meeting, the discussion about my physical limitations, the concern about jet lag and language barriers. It had all been theater, a performance designed to make me feel like the decision was mutual, rational, in my best interests. I sat on my front steps, still in my bathrobe and slippers, staring at evidence of a betrayal so complete that I couldn't quite process it. The morning air felt colder now, and the tearful birdsong from my neighbor's yard sounded mocking. "Brenda, is everything all right over there?" Mrs. Patterson's voice snapped me back to the present. She was standing at the edge of my property, concern written across her face as she took in my appearance. An old woman in her bathrobe, surrounded by papers, looking like she had just received devastating news. "Oh, these?" I gestured vaguely at the documents. "Just some travel advertisements that got blown around in the wind last night. Nothing important." I couldn't tell her the truth. I couldn't say that my own children had been planning to abandon me while pretending to include me in family decisions. I couldn't admit that I had been so thoroughly deceived by the people I trusted most in the world. "Well, if you're sure," Mrs. Patterson said, though she didn't look convinced. "You know I'm always here if you need anything." After she went back to her gardening, I gathered up all the documents and took them inside. I spread them out on my kitchen table, next to the travel research I had planned to throw away, and studied them like a detective examining clues. The more I learned, the angrier I became. This wasn't just a spontaneous family vacation that had grown too complicated for an elderly participant. This was a carefully planned European adventure that had never, not for one single moment, included me. The hotel reservations were for 2 adjoining suites, perfect for their family configuration of 6. The travel insurance coverage listed activities like museum tours and scenic drives, exactly the kind of gentle tourism that would have been perfect for someone my age. There was even a notation about dietary restrictions for one of my grandchildren, showing the level of detail and care that had gone into planning this trip. care that had never extended to considering their grandmother. I made myself a second cup of coffee, stronger this time, and sat back down to think. My first instinct was to call Michael and confront him, to demand an explanation for this deception. But something held me back. Maybe it was pride, or maybe it was the memory of how small I had felt in my living room the night before. Or maybe it was the spark of an idea that was beginning to form in the back of my mind. If my family thought I was too old and frail for adventure, perhaps it was time to prove them wrong. But not by joining their European vacation as an unwanted burden. It was time to plan my own adventure, something that would make their safe, predictable museum tours look like a trip to the grocery store. I looked at my travel research, no longer feeling like discarded dreams, but like the foundation for something magnificent. If they wanted to treat me like I was invisible, fine. But they were about to learn that invisible people can accomplish incredible things. It was time to show my family exactly what this old grandmother was capable of. The next 3 hours were a whirlwind of research, phone calls, and decision-making unlike anything I had experienced in decades. I felt like a different person. Someone who had been sleeping inside me for years and was finally waking up. My first call was to Carol Martinez at Adventure Travel Specialists, a woman I had found through an online search for senior adventure travel. When I explained what I was looking for, her voice lit up with excitement. "Brenda, I love working with clients who are ready to break out of their comfort zones," Carol said. "At 67, you're actually in our sweet spot demographic. Our most adventurous travelers are often people who have spent decades taking care of everyone else and are finally ready to take care of themselves." We spent an hour on the phone discussing destinations and activities. When I mentioned that I wanted something more exciting than Europe, something that would challenge every assumption my family had about my limitations, Carol's enthusiasm became infectious. "New Zealand," she said without hesitation. "It's got everything. Stunning scenery, adventure activities for all skill levels, and some of the friendliest people on Earth. Plus, it's got a reputation as a destination for fearless travelers. When you come back with photos of yourself bungee jumping in Queenstown, your family is going to need therapy." Bungee jumping. The word sent a thrill of terror and excitement through me. I had never done anything more adventurous than riding the Ferris wheel at the county fair, but something about the idea of leaping off a bridge attached to nothing but a rope appealed to the part of me that had been buried under decades of being sensible. "Tell me more," I said. By the end of our conversation, I had booked a 2-week adventure tour of New Zealand's South Island, bungee jumping in Queenstown, hiking the famous Milford Track, swimming with dolphins in Akaroa, and a tandem skydiving experience that made my palms sweat just thinking about it. The total cost was slightly more than my saved $15,000. But Carol assured me that it would be worth every penny. "This isn't just a vacation, Brenda," she said as we finalized the booking. "This is a transformation experience. You're going to come back a different person." My next call was to Dr. Martinez, my family physician, to schedule the medical clearance required for some of the more extreme activities. When I explained what I was planning, there was a long pause on the other end of the line. "Brenda, I have to ask," Dr. Martinez said carefully, "is this some kind of midlife crisis, or are you feeling depressed about something?" I laughed, actually laughed for the first time in 24 hours. "Doctor, I'm 67 years old. If this is a midlife crisis, I'm planning to live to be 134. "In that case," he said, and I could hear the smile in his voice, "let's get you cleared for adventure. Come in tomorrow morning and we'll do a full physical workup. Based on your last checkup and your current activity level, I don't anticipate any problems." The rest of the morning was spent on practical preparations. I drove to the outdoor gear store at the mall, a place I had walked past hundreds of times but never entered. The young saleswoman, probably my granddaughter's age, was initially skeptical when I explained what I needed equipment for. "Ma'am, are you sure about the bungee jumping?" she asked, holding up a harness that looked both terrifying and exciting. "It's pretty intense, even for experienced adventure travelers." "Honey," I replied, trying on a pair of hiking boots that felt like armor for my feet, "at my age, getting out of bed every morning is pretty intense. I think I can handle a little rope jumping." By noon, I had purchased more outdoor gear than I had owned in my entire life. Hiking boots, waterproof jackets, adventure pants with more pockets than I knew what to do with, and a new suitcase designed for international travel. The total cost made me wince, but the excitement I felt made every dollar worthwhile. My final stop was the electronics store where I purchased my first smartphone. The teenage salesperson was patient as he explained Instagram, Facebook, and something called TikTok. Mrs. Johnson, he said, showing me how to take a selfie. You're going to love social media. It's perfect for sharing travel photos and staying connected with family. Family. The word brought me back to reality with a thud. In a few hours I would need to explain to my children that I wouldn't be available to house sit while they were in Europe. I would need to tell them that their elderly, frail, too old mother was going on her own adventure. But first, I had one more call to make. Mrs. Patterson, it's Brenda. I have a huge favor to ask you. The next morning arrived with the kind of crystalline clarity that makes everything seem possible. I had slept better than I had in months. My dreams filled with mountain peaks and ocean views instead of the usual anxiety about doctor appointments and grocery lists. My family was scheduled to leave for the airport at 10 a.m., and I had volunteered to help them load their luggage and see them off. It was the kind of gesture they expected from me. The supportive mother and grandmother who would wave goodbye from the driveway and then return to her quiet house to wait for their return. They had no idea that my own flight to Auckland was leaving just 6 hours after theirs. Michael arrived first, as always punctual and organized. His luggage was perfectly matched, expensive leather pieces that probably cost more than my entire adventure tour. He knocked on my door at exactly 9 a.m., checking his watch and looking mildly impatient even though he was early. "Morning, Mom," he said, giving me a distracted kiss on the cheek. "Thanks for doing this. I know it's not the vacation you wanted, but it really means a lot to have you watching the house. The vacation I wanted, if only he knew." "Of course, dear," I replied, helping him carry his bags to the car. "I've prepared a detailed list of everything that needs to be done while you're gone." Sarah and her family arrived next, their van packed with enough luggage for a month-long expedition. The teenagers looked excited but trying to hide it, the way adolescents do when they don't want to seem too enthusiastic about family activities. "Mom, you're a lifesaver," Sarah said, hugging me quickly before turning to direct David and the kids in organizing their bags. "I've left emergency contact numbers on the refrigerator, and Mrs. Patterson has our itinerary if anything urgent comes up." Emergency contact numbers. The irony wasn't lost on me. Finally, Jennifer arrived with Michael's 2 daughters, both girls bouncing with excitement about their first trip to Europe. Jennifer looked stressed and organized, the way she always did when managing family logistics. "Brenda, I can't thank you enough," Jennifer said, though her tone suggested this was more obligation than gratitude. "I've left detailed instructions about the security system, the garbage pickup schedule, and watering requirements for all your plants. The house key is under the blue flower pot, just like always." As they loaded the last of their bags, I felt a moment of genuine sadness. Despite everything that had happened, these were my children and grandchildren. I loved them, even when they made me feel invisible. But love doesn't mean accepting disrespect, and it doesn't mean making yourself smaller to accommodate other people's limited expectations. "Grandma, I wish you were coming with us," 16-year-old Emma said, giving me a real hug instead of the quick obligatory embraces the adults had offered. "Maybe next time, sweetheart," I replied, though I knew there wouldn't be a next time. Not the way things used to be. Michael started the van and the convoy of family vehicles began pulling out of my driveway. I stood on my front porch waving goodbye, playing the role of the abandoned grandmother perfectly. As soon as their cars disappeared around the corner, I went inside and called Mrs. Patterson. "They're gone," I announced. "How are you feeling?" she asked. "Like I'm about to do something that will either be the best decision of my life or land me in the emergency room. At our age, dear, those are often the same thing." Mrs. Patterson arrived 20 minutes later with her own suitcase. When I had asked her to house sit, I had been completely honest about my plans and my family's deception. Her response had been immediate and enthusiastic. "Brenda, honey, I've been waiting 30 years for one of my neighbors to do something this spectacular," she had said. "Of course I'll watch your house, and when you get back I want to hear every single detail." My taxi arrived at noon, and as the driver loaded my new adventure gear into his trunk, I felt a transformation happening inside me. The nervous, apologetic woman who had been dismissed in her own living room 3 days ago was disappearing, replaced by someone I barely recognized but instantly liked. The airport was busier than I had expected, full of travelers with their own stories and destinations. As I checked in for my flight, the airline agent looked at my passport and itinerary with professional interest. "New Zealand solo travel," she noted. "Adventure tour package. Are you meeting family there?" "No," I replied, and the word felt like freedom. "This is just for me." To my surprise, there was an upgrade available to first class, something about a computer glitch and oversold economy seats. as I settled into a leather seat wider than my living room chair, accepting a glass of champagne from a flight attendant who treated me like an honored guest instead of a burden. I took out my new phone and composed my first Instagram post. The photo was simple, my passport and boarding pass, with the caption, "Adventure has no expiration date." Within minutes, I had my first like and comment from a complete stranger. "You go, girl, living your best life." Living my best life. I was 67 years old and I was just getting started. 22 hours later, I stepped off a plane in Queenstown, New Zealand, feeling like I had traveled to another planet. The air was crisp and clean, the mountains were impossibly dramatic, and everyone I met seemed genuinely happy to see tourists. My adventure guide, Jake, was waiting at the airport with a sign bearing my name. He was probably 30 years old, with the kind of outdoor tan and easy confidence that comes from spending your life in beautiful places doing exciting things. "Brenda Johnson?" he asked, extending his hand with a smile that made me feel immediately welcome. "I'm Jake, and I'll be your guide for the next 2 weeks. I have to say, when Carol told me about your itinerary, I was impressed. We don't get many 67-year-olds signing up for our extreme adventure package." "Well," I replied, shaking his hand firmly, "I've spent 67 years being practical. I thought it was time to try something different." The drive from the airport to my hotel was like traveling through a postcard. Lake Wakatipu stretched out like a mirror, reflecting mountains that looked too perfect to be real. Jake pointed out landmarks and shared stories about the region's history, but I was too overwhelmed by the beauty to absorb much detail. "Tomorrow we start with the helicopter tour," Jake explained as we pulled up to my hotel. "It's a great way to get oriented and see the landscape from above before we start the ground-level adventures." "Then Wednesday is your big day, bungee jumping," he said with a grin. "The Kawarau Gorge Bridge, 43 meters of pure adrenaline. You sure you're ready for this?" I looked out at the mountains surrounding this beautiful town, thinking about my family who were probably touring the Louvre at that exact moment, looking at other people's adventures hanging on museum walls. "Jake," I said, "I've never been more ready for anything in my life." The hotel was nicer than any place I had ever stayed, with a view of the lake that made me understand why people traveled halfway around the world to see it. As I unpacked my new adventure gear, I felt like I was preparing for battle. In a way, I was. I was fighting against every limitation that had been placed on me, every assumption that had made me smaller than I needed to be. That evening, I called home to check in with Mrs. Patterson and let her know I had arrived safely. She was delighted to hear about the flight and the scenery, and she had news of her own. "Your son Michael called this afternoon," she reported. "He wanted to make sure you were settled in and comfortable. I told him you were doing wonderfully and seemed very content. Did he ask for details?" "He did, but I kept it vague. Just said you were staying busy and seemed to be enjoying your quiet time." We both laughed at that. Quiet time. If only he knew. After dinner, I took my new phone and walked along the lake shore, taking photos and trying to figure out how to post them on Instagram. The learning curve was steep, but the teenage salesperson had been right about the appeal of social media. There was something magical about capturing a moment and sharing it with the world. My second Instagram post was a photo of the lake at sunset, with the caption, "Day 1 of proving that adventure has no age limit." This time, I got dozens of likes and several comments from people encouraging my journey. Complete strangers from around the world were cheering me on, while my own family had no idea what I was capable of. The next morning brought my first real adventure, a helicopter tour of the surrounding mountains and fjords. I had never been in a helicopter before, and the combination of terror and exhilaration as we lifted off the ground was unlike anything I had ever experienced. "How are you doing back there, Brenda?" Jake asked through the headset as we soared over peaks that looked like they belonged in a fantasy movie. "I feel like I'm flying," I replied, and realized it was the most honest thing I had said in years. But the helicopter tour was just preparation for the main event. The next morning, standing on the edge of the Kawarau Gorge Bridge with a bungee cord attached to my ankles, I was about to discover exactly who I really was. The platform was smaller than I had expected, and the gorge below looked deeper and more terrifying than any photograph could capture. Jake was beside me, checking my harness and explaining the safety procedures, but his voice seemed to be coming from very far away. "The key is not to think too much," he said. "When I count to 3, just jump. Your body will want to hesitate, but trust the equipment and trust yourself." Trust yourself. When was the last time anyone had asked me to do that? I thought about my family, probably eating breakfast in a Parisian cafe at that moment, discussing their plans for the day. Museums and monuments, guided tours and gift shops, safe, predictable, age-appropriate activities. I thought about the travel brochures scattered on my lawn, evidence of how little they believed in my capabilities. I thought about all the dreams I had deferred, all the adventures I had postponed, all the times I had made myself smaller to fit into other people's expectations. "Ready, Brenda?" Jake asked. I looked out at the mountains, at the river far below, at the vast sky that suddenly felt like it belonged to me. "I've been ready for 67 years, I said, and I jumped. The next few seconds were pure terror and pure joy simultaneously. The ground rushed up to meet me, the cord caught me at exactly the right moment, and I bounced back up toward the bridge in a moment of weightless triumph that felt like being reborn. When they pulled me back up to the platform, I was crying and laughing at the same time. Jake was grinning like he had just witnessed something special. "How do you feel?" he asked. "Like I could do anything," I replied, and meant it. That evening, I posted a video of my bungee jump on Instagram with the simple caption, 67 and fearless. Within hours, it had been shared hundreds of times, with comments from people around the world celebrating my courage. But the best part came that night when my phone rang with a video call from my family in Paris. They were all crowded around Michael's phone, calling to check in on their house-sitting grandmother. "Hi, Mom," Michael said. "We're just calling to see how you're doing. We're at the Eiffel Tower and the kids wanted to show you the view." "That's wonderful, dear," I replied, adjusting my phone so they could see the mountain vista behind me. "I'm doing very well, having quite an adventure, actually." There was a moment of silence as they processed what they were seeing. Instead of their familiar living room, my background showed dramatic peaks and a lake that definitely wasn't in their neighborhood. "Mom," Sarah said slowly. "Where are you?" "New Zealand," I replied, casually, as if it were the most natural thing in the world, Queenstown to be specific. "I just went bungee jumping this afternoon." The silence stretched longer this time. I could see their faces in the phone screen, expressions ranging from confusion to shock to something that might have been respect. "You went bungee jumping?" Emma asked, her teenage skepticism replaced by genuine amazement. 43 meters, I confirmed. "Tomorrow I'm hiking the Milford Track and next week I'm going skydiving." "But Mom," Michael said, his lawyer training kicking in as he tried to process this information, "you're supposed to be watching the house. You said you would be responsible for taking care of things while we were gone." I smiled at the phone, feeling more powerful than I had in decades. "The house is being watched, don't worry. Mrs. Patterson is staying there while I'm traveling. As for being responsible, I'm being responsible for my own happiness for the first time in years." "This is insane," Jennifer said, though I noticed she didn't sound angry, just stunned. "How did you even plan all this? When did you book the trip?" "Oh, I've been planning it for a while," I replied. "Technically true if you counted the 3 days since I found their tickets on my lawn. I just didn't mention it because I didn't want to interfere with your family vacation." I reached into my purse and pulled out the airline tickets I had found scattered across my yard, holding them up to the phone camera. "I found these on my lawn the morning after our family meeting," I said calmly. "Funny thing though, they're dated 2 weeks before our discussion about whether I was too old to travel with you. I have to say, your planning skills are impressive." The silence this time was deafening. I could see my children's faces as they realized their deception had been discovered, their carefully constructed narrative falling apart in real time. "Mom, we can explain," Sarah began. "I'm sure you can," I replied. "But right now I have a mountain sunrise to catch in the morning, so I need to get some sleep. Enjoy the rest of your museum tours. I'll talk to you when we're both back home." I hung up before anyone could respond, feeling lighter than I had felt in years. 2 weeks later, I returned home transformed in ways I never could have imagined. My skin was tanned, my muscles were stronger, and my confidence was unshakable. I had hiked through rainforests, jumped out of airplanes, swum with dolphins, and discovered that courage isn't the absence of fear, it's doing amazing things despite being afraid. Mrs. Patterson was waiting for me at the airport, eager to hear every detail of my adventure. As we drove through my familiar neighborhood, everything looked the same but felt different. I was seeing my world through the eyes of someone who had proven she could handle anything. "How does it feel to be home?" Mrs. Patterson asked. "Like I'm a visitor in my own life," I replied. "But a welcome visitor." My family was scheduled to return from Europe the next day, and I spent the evening organizing my photographs and preparing for what I knew would be a difficult conversation. I wasn't angry anymore, though. I was something much more powerful. I was changed. The reunion at the airport was awkward in ways that family reunions had never been before. My children and grandchildren looked exhausted from their long flights and jet-lagged from the time change. I looked refreshed and energetic, still glowing from 2 weeks of adventure and accomplishment. "Mom," Michael said carefully, As we walked to the baggage claim, "We need to talk about what happened." "Yes," I agreed. "We do." The conversation took place that evening around my dining room table, the same table where I had spread out travel brochures just 3 weeks earlier. But now the dynamic was completely different. I wasn't asking for permission or approval. I was setting boundaries. "I want to understand why you felt you needed to lie to me," I began, my voice calm but firm. "Not just about the trip, but about the planning process. You made me feel like my limitations were the problem, when the real problem was that you had never considered including me in the first place." Michael, always the lawyer, tried to defend their decision with logic and concern for my well-being. Sarah talked about practical considerations and family dynamics. Jennifer mentioned something about not wanting to burden me with travel stress. But my granddaughter Emma, 16 years old and brutal in the way only teenagers can be, cut through all the adult explanations with a single observation. "You guys were embarrassed by Grandma," she said simply. "You thought she would slow you down or embarrass you in front of other people. But look at her Instagram. She's got like 50,000 followers now, and everyone thinks she's amazing. 50,000 followers." I had been so busy having adventures that I hadn't been paying attention to my social media accounts. Apparently, videos of a 67-year-old grandmother bungee jumping and skydiving had struck a chord with people around the world. The conversation continued for another hour, with apologies and explanations and promises to do better in the future. But the most important change had already happened. I was no longer asking for their approval or acceptance. I was informing them of how things would be going forward. "I love you all," I concluded, "but I'm not going to make myself smaller to fit into your expectations anymore. I'm planning a safari in Kenya for next year, and I'm hoping some of you will want to join me, but I'm going either way." 3 months later, I was back at my dining room table, but this time the conversation was completely different. My son Michael was helping me research safari companies while Sarah looked up vaccination requirements for travel to East Africa. Even Jennifer was contributing suggestions about travel insurance and safety precautions. But the biggest change was in my grandchildren. Emma had asked if she could come with me, and her enthusiasm had infected her younger cousins. Suddenly, Grandma wasn't the fragile elderly relative who needed protection from the world. I was the cool grandmother who had adventures and Instagram followers and stories that made their friends jealous. "Grandma," 12-year-old Jake asked, looking up from his research on African wildlife, "do you think I'm old enough to go on safari with you?" I looked around the table at my family, seeing respect in their eyes instead of pity, inclusion instead of exclusion. "Honey," I replied, "I think you're never too young to start having adventures, and you're never too old to begin." 6 months later, I was standing in the Serengeti watching elephants graze in the golden light of an African sunset, surrounded by 3 of my grandchildren and my daughter Sarah, all of us transformed by the shared experience of adventure. That evening, as we sat around our campfire sharing stories and planning the next day's wildlife viewing, Sarah looked at me with something I had never seen in her eyes before. "Mom," she said quietly, "I owe you an apology, not just for the Europe trip, but for all the times I underestimated you. You've taught us that growing older doesn't mean growing smaller." I looked up at the vast African sky, filled with more stars than I had ever seen, and thought about the journey that had brought us to this moment. It had started with betrayal and hurt feelings, but it had led to something much more valuable, the discovery that it's never too late to surprise yourself and the people who love you. "The thing about adventures," I replied, "is that they're not really about the places you go or the things you do. They're about discovering who you really are when you stop letting other people define your limitations." As I post this story and look back on that transformative year, I want to ask you something. What dreams have you been putting off because someone told you that you were too old, too inexperienced, or too impractical? What adventures are waiting for you if you stop asking for permission and start giving yourself the green light? I'd love to hear about your own stories of breaking free from limitations in the comments below. Have you ever had to prove your capabilities to people who underestimated you? What's the most adventurous thing you've done that surprised everyone, including yourself? If this story inspired you to think differently about age and adventure, please hit that like button and share it with someone who needs to hear that it's never too late to surprise yourself. Don't forget to subscribe for more stories about people who refuse to let others define their limitations. And remember, whether you're 17 or 70, the best adventures begin the moment you stop asking for permission to live your own life. Thank you for listening to my story, and I hope it encourages you to write your own adventure story, starting today. The world is waiting for you, and age is just a number on your passport.